Hey guys, so this week we are going over chapter 23, which is the last chapter when we're talking about plant structures. We're going to be talking more about photosynthesis and then respiration, and then we'll get into some of the human body systems. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so plant tissues, you have a couple different types. You have dermal, vascular, and ground tissue. So these tissues kind of interlace and they intertwine, right? They're found in different places, and they help to, transport water and nutrients and other things that the plants need. So if we look at the cross section of a leaf, on the outside you'll see dermal tissue. Dermal is like dermis, right? It's like your epidermis. It's like your skin. So dermal tissue for a plant is, what's on the outside. It's like the plant's skin. Vascular tissue is noted here by red and yellow, and that is the tissue that helps to carry nutrients. So you can see here there's some vascular tissue in the leaf, and then there's some smaller portions here, and then same thing with the stem and root. We have dermal tissue, we have vascular tissue, and then the remainder of the tissue is called ground tissue. So ground tissue in this is shown as the gray, okay, so it's everything between here and around here, and the ground tissue is what produces and stores food for the plant. So all of these are very important. All right, so here's a closer look at the vascular tissue. Remember I showed you earlier it was shown in two different colors, red and yellow, and that is because there's two different types of vascular tissue. So we have xylem and phloem. So vascular tissue, the whole purpose is to transport water and nutrients, okay? And because plants can grow very tall, they need to be able to transport nutrients and water, sometimes, that hundreds of feet against gravity, right? So these vascular tissues are what assist in that. So when you look at xylem, okay, xylem has two different types of cells. They have tracheids and vessel elements. So tracheids are more narrow, and the vessel elements are shorter. So tracheids have walls between cells in a stack, and vessel elements form an open tube. So if you look here, you can kind of see these walls. They're a little bit diagonal, right? And then the vessel elements are an open tube. Phloem has two types as well, and those two types are sieve tube elements and companion cells. So companion cells are smaller. They're found around the outside of the sieve tube elements. And then the sieve tube elements, where are they? Right over here. You can see they run down the center of the companion cells, and they have these little almost like grates in between them. And these small holes allow the nutrients to move from cell to cell, and as these sieve tube elements mature, they lose their nuclei and most other organelles. The remaining organelles hug the inside of the cell wall, and they're kept alive by those companion cells. So companion cells support the phloem cells, and they aid in the movement of the substances through the phloem. Right, ground tissue is the tissue that produces and stores sugars, and it contributes to the physical support of the plant. All right, so the next topic is apical meristems. And whether you know it or not, we have looked at apical meristems in class before. So a meristem is the kind of growth region of a plant, and apical comes from the word apex, which means, if you know any kind of Latin, it's kind of like the end, right? So the meristems in these regions they grow very rapidly, and this is typically found roots and shoots, okay? So new growth and new growth on the roots. So when you remember looking at the onion root tip cells, remember I told you to look right towards the tip, right? Because that's where most of the growth would be. So the two types are going to be stem, okay, so that new growth at the top of the plant, and then root apical meristems. All right, types of root systems. So plant roots are something that have not been studied for a very long time, but in 1937 there was a study that was done on a single rye plant. A botanist named Howard Dittmer showed that the length of all the branches in that rye plant root system was about 630 kilometers, which is like 387 miles, and that the surface area of those roots was more than 600 square meters. So that's 130 times greater than the combined areas of its stems and its leaves. So when we're looking at roots, plants can have two main different types of root systems. The first one is a taproot. Second one is a fibrous root. So a taproot, the plant's going to have a single strong root that it tends to be fairly thick and extends deep into the ground. And then off of that taproot, they tend to have some smaller roots for absorbing nutrients and water and things like that. Fibrous roots are, if you've ever grown like wheatgrass or catnip, things like that, you've probably seen these fibrous roots, and they are just that. There's no single strong root. There's just a bunch of really fine roots, okay? And because there's so many roots, they can absorb a lot of nutrients and a lot of water. Trees a lot of times will have a taproot because the single strong root growing straight down helps a lot with stability, and then they'll have roots that kind of spread out closer to the surface as well. So when we look at root anatomy, okay, you're still going to have dermal, vascular, and ground tissue, right? Dermal tissue is on the surface, okay? Vascular tissue is in the center here, and then our ground tissue is found, between the dermis and the vascular tissue. So here you can see some of those root hairs that help to absorb nutrients. We've got the cortex and the endodermis, which is kind of like a secondary dermal tissue within the root. Next, we have these two structures here, the one in yellow and the one in red. I'm sure you can kind of guess what those are based on the previous slides. So we have phloem and xylem. And down here, this is what I told you we're looking at on the microscope. That is our apical meristem. And last but not least, we have a really interesting structure down here that is outside the apical meristem and the dermal tissue. And this is known as a root cap. Now, as the root is pushing through dirt and rocks and soil, right, obviously that dermal tissue can be kind of sensitive. So this root cap, it protects the root tip from damage as it's pushing through the soil and dirt. So this is our root cap. Right, and the root function, right? So root's main function is absorbing water and nutrients. So the water passes into the root. Okay, you can see here, red is the active transport of minerals, and blue is the movement of water by osmosis. So if there is more water out here than in here, it is going to flow into the root. Okay, and the same with those nutrients that are being actively transported into the root. So once they're transported into the root, they go into the xylem and phloem, where they can be transported to the rest of the plant. This here is a root hair, the epidermis once again, cortex once again, and the xylem and phloem. Okay. All right, and the last thing on this slide is the Casparian strip. And the Casparian strip ensures that water and dissolved nutrients pass through the cell membranes before entering the vascular cylinder, and that helps to regulate what actually gets into the plant. All right, so stems, if you've ever gone outside and looked at a branch or bush, you've seen that there are stems. Off of those stems come leaves. So some of the functions of stems are to provide a support system. They help to transport water and nutrients. They contain xylem and phloem. They can also be a defensive system that protects the plant against predators and disease. They can produce leaves, branches, and flowers. They hold leaves up to the sun, right, so that they can photosynthesize. And then in many plants, stems are also a place where a lot of storage of nutrients is done. So node, which is right here, okay, stems produce nodes, and from those nodes, they're going to produce a leaf. So if you look here, here's a little bud, okay. And a bud will eventually grow to produce new stems and leaves. So there it is, bud. So last week we talked a lot about monocot and dicots, so their stems are going to be different as well. If you remember, I did show you that one of them had vascular tissue around the edges, the other one had it kind of interspersed. Hopefully you remember which one's which, right? So think to yourself, which one is this one on the left? Okay, so here we have epidermis, we have ground tissue, and vascular bundles once again, so you can see how all of these things are arranged. And on the left, obviously, is the monocot. Right, we have these vascular bundles all situated around the outside, which indicates that it is a dicot. We also have the pith. So in dicots, the parenchyma cells inside the ring of vascular tissue are known as pith. I'm not going to ask you about that, so don't worry about that too much. All right, and primary and secondary growth. So unlike animals, the growth of most plants is not precisely determined. So plant growth is carefully controlled and regulated, and depending upon the species, so plant growth tends to follow very characteristic patterns. Okay. So just a little review here of the structures. Hopefully you would be able to label these at this point. So here we have the epidermis, here we have the cortex, here we have the phloem and the xylem, and here is the pith. Okay. Now by looking at this, we can also tell that this plant is a dicot, right? Because the vascular bundles are found in a ring. And the growth of new cells produced by the apical meristems of the root and the stems add length to the plant. So this pattern of growth occurring at the end of the plant is called primary growth. So primary growth of stems is the result of elongation of cells produced in the apical meristem. So primary growth takes place in all seeded plants. So if the plants will undergo secondary growth, a vascular cambium will appear. Let's see, I believe they have that on here. There we go. So the vascular cambium here is this green line. So if you've ever heard of, counting the rings of a tree, the rings of the tree are the vascular cambium. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So that in secondary growth, the vascular cambium divides, producing secondary xylem to the inside and secondary phloem to the outside. So let's see, vascular cambium once again is the green. The secondary xylem is on the inside, and the secondary phloem is on the outside. Here is the cork cambium, which is a new thing that we're going to talk about. And in the cork, let's go back, one too far. All right, in the cork cambium and the cork, that would be what would be commonly known as the bark on a tree. All right, so let's move on to leaves. So the anatomy of a leaf, here's a nice little cross section. You have the petiole, which is kind of the stem, and then we have the blade of the leaf. Now if we look at a leaf up close, you're going to have epidermis. Outside the epidermis, you're going to have this waxy substance, and that is known as the cuticle. If you've ever kind of tried to mix oil and water, right, they don't mix. So the cuticle is waxy, it's oil-based, so it doesn't allow water to really be released from the leaf, which helps to keep the leaf from drying out. Next we have xylem and phloem again, okay, and these are referred to as a vein in the leaf. So if you've looked at leaves and you've seen all those little branching veins, you're looking at the xylem and the phloem. And then we have chloroplasts, obviously those help to photosynthesize, and those are arranged into two different layers, the palisade mesophyll and the spongy mesophyll. Wouldn't worry too much about those two terms, but I would definitely know chloroplast, xylem, phloem, vein, cuticle, epidermis. The most important feature of a leaf, in my opinion, are the stoma. So these are the stoma down here. They're little holes that allow the leaves to regulate how much gas transfer there is between the inside and the outside. So, for example, if there's an abundance of water, too much water, and the plant needs to kind of get rid of some, it could open all of its stoma, and then that water could escape the leaf, right? If there was not enough water, then the plant could kind of close down its stoma to prevent it from drying out. Obviously, at the end of the day, if it doesn't get water for months, or for an extended period of time, it's still probably going to die, but it can help to regulate its own water supply using those stoma. And here's what those stoma look like. So they have guard cells, which are actually the ones that open. And then there's also an inner cell wall. Okay. If we were in class, I would pull out a group of slides and I'll let you actually look at the stoma under a microscope. Hopefully we'll get back there and we'll be able to look at those. So transport in plants. So if you've ever dipped a paper towel into water, you've kind of seen how water transport in plant works, right? So if you dip just the corner of a piece of paper towel in water, you'll notice that the water travels up the paper towel, right? Because paper towels are made of cellulose, which are the same things that plant cells are made out of. So as water evaporates from leaves, okay, it eventually creates a vacuum that helps draw the water up the stem of the plant. Okay, so if you've ever done that paper towel experiment, then you kind of understand. If you haven't, then I highly suggest you do it. Now, another thing you can kind of do to demonstrate this would be to dip a paper towel in water and suspend it over 2 cups, and you can put dye in one and no dye in the other. And after a day or so, you'll see dye in both of them. So you can see that water is being transferred up and over that strip of paper towel. Right, capillary action. So to pull water upward, plants take advantage of capillary action, which is a physical force of cohesion. So water molecules are attracted to each other by cohesion, right? So that's water to water. If you remember, adhesion was water to something else. So water cohesion is strong because of the hydrogen bonds that water molecules form. And then the water molecules can form hydrogen bonds with other substances, right, which would be adhesion. So if you're looking at these empty glass tubes in various diameters, all right, in a dish of water, you can see both cohesion and adhesion. So the tendency of the water to rise in a thin tube is called capillary action. Water is attracted to the walls of the tube, and water molecules are attracted to one another, which helps to pull the water upward. So which tube do you think would have the highest column of water? The narrow one, the medium one, or the wide one? All right, so if you guessed the narrow one, you were correct, right? Because it's so narrow, we have less water molecules in here, so forces between them and the forces to the actual glass tube are going to be stronger than in the wide tube. And in plants, it works the same way. So here is how the nutrient transport in plants works. So you can see the nutrients start at a source, okay, and they flow towards the sink. And here we can see both xylem and phloem once again. All right, so that is the end of this section. We're just going to continue on. There's only, I think, 13 slides left in this chapter, so it's just going to be one video. All right, so plant hormones and tropisms. Plant hormones, so what's the role of hormones in plants, right? It's the same thing as the role of hormones in humans. So hormones are chemical signals produced by living organisms that affect growth, activity, and development of cell tissues. So in plants, hormones can act on the same cells in which they're made, or they can travel to different cells and tissues. And this is different than animal hormones that typically act on a location at some distance away. So for example, your pituitary gland produces a lot of hormones, and they act on various areas of your body. So here we have an example of hormone-producing cells. We can see the movement of that hormone, and here would be the target cells. So the first step in the discovery of plant hormones was made by Charles Darwin and his son Francis in 1880. So this image shows a summary of their experiment. The Darwins conducted controlled experiments to determine which region of the plant senses light. So here we can see seedling A. There it is. So this seedling is completely unaltered, right? Just kind of growing as is. What's the difference between A and B? Well, in B, they cut off the tip of the root. Okay, C, they covered it. Okay, so they placed a dark cap on the tip of the seedling. And if you notice, the seedling is not bending towards the light. In D, they placed a clear cap over the tip of the seedling, and it is still bending towards the light. And then in E, they placed a dark cap over the shaft of the seedling, and once again, we are bending towards the light. So the ones that did not bend towards the light were the one where the tip was cut off and where the tip was capped with a dark cap. So the cells within a stem or within a plant that help to detect light based on this experiment would be found in the tip of the seedling. So the Darwins hypothesized that the tip produced a substance that regulated cell growth, and then 40 years later, the regulatory substances produced by the tips of growing plants were identified, and they were named auxins. All right. So this diagram shows the distribution of auxin, which is that plant hormone, in a seedling from that previous experiment. So what is the pattern of distribution for the auxin in relation to the seedling and the light source? So if we look here, okay, there's more auxin on this side, there's less auxin on this side. So auxin concentrations are lower on the side that faces the light and higher on the side that does not face the light. And that causes more growth on this side. More growth on the side away from the light causes the entire stem to bend. And here you can see more auxin and less auxin. So this slide is showing a phenomena called apical dominance. So what apical dominance is if the tip of a plant, okay, or the apical meristem is removed, the lateral buds, okay, or the buds that would grow outward, begin to grow more quickly, and that causes a plant to become bushier. These are both basal plants, right? But on this left one, they pinched off the apical meristem, and therefore we have a bushier plant. And if you're growing basil, obviously this is the preferable plant, right? Because you're going to have a higher yield of basil than in this one. So plant hormone summary. So here are some of the hormones and then the effects and then where they are found. I would not worry too much about memorizing this, but just kind of, read over it. If you look here, the gibberellins, they stimulate growth. They're found in the meristems, root, and seed, right, which is where growth would be happening. The abscisic acid, this inhibits cell division. It's found in terminal buds or end buds and seeds. And then ethylene stimulates fruits to ripen, and it causes plants to seal off and drop unnecessary organs like leaves in the autumn. It's found in fruit tissues, aging leaves, and flowers. Tropisms. This is plants and other animals responding to stimuli by moving. So plants can respond to stimuli by moving too. But movement is typically achieved by growing either toward or away from a stimulus. So for example, here it's showing the sun, and a lot of times you'll see plants kind of grow towards where it can get sun. This is known as phototropism. Okay. Then we have this one here where the plant fell over, unfortunately, but it has started to grow upward, right? Even though its root ball is down this way, it's still growing upward because it needs to reach the sun. And this is it responding to gravity. This is gravitropism. Okay. And then the last one is called thigmotropism. And thigmotropism is really fascinating because this is a plant responding to touch. So what this climbing vine is doing is essentially will swing around the tip of its stem until it touches something, and then it'll start to grow around it. There's a lot of plants that actually respond to touch. Here's another one on the next slide. Okay, so if you've ever played with these, you touch them, they close. Okay, this is called a sensitive plant, or Mimosa pudicea, I believe it's called. Within 2 to 3 seconds, the leaflets fold together, and then, in a little while, they'll open back up. We do have these around here naturally. I used to play with them on the playground when I was in elementary school. Another very famous plant that responds to touch and moves is the Venus flytrap, and obviously responds to the touch of its prey, and it closes around them and digests them. All right, responding to seasons. So in the early 1900s, the 1920s, I believe it was, scientists discovered that tobacco plants flower according to their photoperiod. So the photoperiod is the number of hours of light and darkness that they receive. And then additional research showed that other plants also respond to changing photoperiods. So that's called photoperiodism. Okay. It's a major factor in the timing of seasonal activities like flowering and growth. So the columns in the chart represent three different photoperiods, or relative lengths of day and night. And then the rows show how short day plants and then long day plants would respond to each photoperiod. So if you look here at the short day plant, okay, when it's having long day periods, it's not flowering. Okay, if it has short days, we have flowering, and then interrupted night, we do not have flowering. With a long day plant, okay, if it is exposed to a long day, we have flowering. Short day, no flower. Interrupted night, midnight, we have flowering. All right, winter dormancy. So the phytochrome also regulates the changes in activity that prepare many plants for dormancy and winter periods. So in Florida, we don't really have the changing of the seasons and the dropping of the leaves and that traditional fall period, right? But if you've ever been up north during the fall, or watch videos, you've seen this, and this is when the plants kind of decrease or stop their activity. They drop all their leaves because they don't want to, waste energy supporting these leaves, and they turn off those photosynthetic pathways, and essentially just kind of lock down and go dormant. And that's how they're able to survive the winter. So this is a photo with leaf buds. The hormones produce important changes in the apical meristem. So instead of continuing to produce those leaves, the meristems produce a thick, waxy, substance, like scales almost, that form a protective layer around the new leaf, or the new leaf buds, so that when the spring comes, they're able to then blossom. All right, this is our last section, plants and people. All right, so modern farming is the foundation on which human society was built. North America has some of the richest, most productive cropland in the world, and farmers in the United States and Canada produce so much food that they're able to feed millions of people around the world, as well as our own citizens. So many scholars now trace the beginnings of human civilization to the cultivation of crop plants, because you don't need to be moving around, right? If you can grow your own food, you're not having to constantly hunt for it. So if you can grow food in one place, you can settle down and form civilizations. So a lot of scholars kind of attribute the ability to plant crops and cultivate them to modern civilization developing. New plants have also changed human history. So by introducing new plants into cultivation, the genetic diversity of the food supply can be strengthened, and that helps reduce disease. If anyone's ever heard of, what's happening with the bananas, okay? So if you've ever tried banana Laffy Taffy, 100 years ago, that was the actual flavor of bananas, supposedly. I don't know, I wasn't around then. But those bananas or that breed of banana was essentially wiped out by disease. So now there's a new form of banana, and that's what we know as bananas. So here's an example with a variety of potatoes, right? So we have red, purple, and your traditional, kind of white, yellow potatoes. So by having varieties like this, it helps to prevent massive die-offs like have happened with the bananas. There's also seed banks, so there's a few of them around our planet where these seeds are just kind of held and maintained. So if anything were to happen, for example, an apocalypse, we could go, once everything had calmed down, pull the seeds from these seed banks and be able to recultivate and grow food again. So these help to kind of safeguard biodiversity. And these seeds can remain viable for hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years, as long as they're maintained properly. And then fiber, wood, and medicine. So many of the most important uses that plants have really nothing to do with food. If you're sitting in any kind of building right now, chances are you're surrounded by plants in some capacity. So for example, I'm sitting at my dining room table, which is wooden. Above my head, I have my roof, which has wooden trusses in it. Okay. You may be using a wooden pencil. If you play an instrument, a lot of times those are made of wood, right? If you're wearing clothing, chances are you're probably wearing cotton, which is another plant fiber. So these plants are all around us. And the last kind of use is medicine. So a lot of plants have medicinal properties. I'm not saying this one in particular does, but this is a rosy periwinkle, and it is being looked at as a potential treatment for cancer, not the plant itself, but one of the compounds that it produces. Don't go around eating these, please. So many of our medicines actually have a biological basis, and they come from plants that exist. So that is the end of the PowerPoint. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out. I am more than happy to help. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. You have a little bit of a lighter load this week, so I hopefully you appreciate that, and hopefully you get it done quickly. Same as the previous weeks. Assigned on Sunday, it's going to be due on Friday. And if you have any trouble, let me know. Have a wonderful day.